Hello, thank you so much for allowing me to speak to you today about regulation of salmon farming in Western Canada, where change is certainly underway. So, salmon farms exist in Canada in a legal gray zone because, number one, they attempt to privatize ocean spaces, which is not recognized in Canada. Number two, they claim to own the fish in their pens. This is also not recognized in Canada. Because it's the same ocean inside the pen as outside the pen, the same laws exist inside the farms as outside, which prohibits the ownership of fish. There's no private fish in the ocean in Canada. And three, they try to pass as farms and thus be regulated by the provincial governments instead of the federal government. I took this to court in 2009 and won, and it was decided it was unlawful for the province to be regulating an industry that existed in a federal jurisdiction, the ocean. So the court ruled that they are a private fishery, but private fisheries also are not recognized to exist in Canada. Strangely, somehow in eastern Canada, they still are farms where they're regulated by the provincial government. And we know from the legal action in British Columbia that this is unlawful. It's also very important to recognize that salmon farms break natural laws. First of all, they exclude predators. The predators take away the sick out of the population, so they prevent diseases from spreading. They also crowd salmon, which enhances disease transmission. And the infected salmon die slowly while shedding unnatural levels of pathogens because the predators were not able to stop this. So what does regulating salmon farms really mean? What is possible? How can you protect wild fish from salmon farming activities? Are Canadian regulations working? And is there anywhere in the world salmon farm regulations are protecting wild salmon? So when you look at a farm, first of all, you can see it's physically impossible for any regulation to prevent the unnatural loading of the area outside the pens, the sea lice larvae, bacteria, and viruses. The farmers are depending on the currents entering the pens and then carrying the waste out, and with it go all these pathogens. So it's a basic part of salmon farming is allowing what's in the pens to come out. Are sea lice regulations working in Canada? No. All the drugs have failed. We had the drug Slice. It was working quite well. And then about 2015, it stopped. Sea lice levels started to go up on the wild fish again. So the industry brought their big boats over from Norway. This is Grieg's Ranja Islander. They're performing hydrogen peroxide and freshwater treatments, but they're failing. And so they have to treat the fish again and again and again. They brought the hydrolysers over. These are mechanical treatments that try to remove the sea lice with pressurized seawater, but they're releasing the sea lice. The larvae and eggs are getting out. They're also damaging the farm fish, which sets the stage for outbreaks of disease. In 2023, Maui, who was struggling to control their lice, simply stopped certification. They dropped their certification and they stopped public reporting of the number of lice on the farms. So they couldn't solve the problem, and as far as I can see, they're just now withholding the evidence, so we can't track this any longer. Canadian regulators are reluctant to charge farming companies for breach of license regarding sea lice. This is an email from a Fisheries and Oceans Canada veterinarian. She says a Cermak farm has exceeded the sea lice threshold. It's supposed to be 3 motiles, it's 14.22. She says this looks like a violation of their condition of license. Cermak was never charged. The regulations were weakened when they were reissued a few months later. And the company was granted a near 50% increase in production just 3 months later. We all know that sea lice from salmon farms are infecting young wild salmon. This research has been done again and again here in British Columbia, but also in Norway. This is from Krakosik et al., 2005. Along the x-axis is the migration of wild salmon. 0 is the farm placements, And you can see in the top row, which is the copepodites, the most juvenile stage of lice, those spike when the young salmon are passing the salmon farms. And this was a huge project. And like I said, there's many other papers. We know sea lice from salmon farms are infecting wild salmon. And yet, government scientists in Canada, just this January, produced this Science Advisory Secretariat on the association between sea lice on the farms and sea lice on wild fish. And they conclude no statistically significant association was observed between the infestations on the farms versus on the wild fish. Even though when you look back into the records that produced this report, there were significant associations. What about the regulation of viruses, for example, Piscine orthoreovirus in British Columbia? So this virus, which is from the North Atlantic, is found in most salmon farms in British Columbia. Everybody agrees on that, even the industry. The industry reported in a lawsuit that many of their hatcheries were or are infected with this virus. And Canadian regulations prohibit the transfer of fish that are infected with a disease agent into marine farms from hatcheries. So in other words, if Piscine orthoreovirus is recognized in Canada as a disease agent, the salmon farming industry would be prohibited from transferring fish in their hatcheries if they're infected. So in 2016, a Canadian research, Dr. Kyle Garver, sent samples of PRV from British Columbia to Dr. Espen Rimstad in Norway and asked him to challenge Atlantics to see if it was causing disease. Dr. Rimstad wrote back to Dr. Garver, so there's no doubt that the isolate you sent us causes HSMI. I would not recommend to use energy about the question if PRV causes HSMI. So Rimstad is confirming that PRV is a disease agent. While the rest of the world knows this, the scientists within Canada's regulator, so within Fisheries and Oceans Canada, are divided. Government scientists that are publishing with industry, and I put a circle around the marine harvest author, they are saying PRV is not a disease agent in British Columbia. But other scientists in Fisheries and Oceans Canada are saying the opposite. They're saying actually it is causing two diseases, one in Atlantics and one in Pacific salmon. So while PRV causes heart and skeleton muscle inflammation in Atlantic salmon, it appears to cause jaundice anemia in Pacific salmon, turning them yellow. I'm very curious if you are seeing these yellow-pink salmon that are invading Norway and the North Atlantic. Are you seeing these yellow salmon in your waters? The yellow extends right down into the heart. So this is the problem. Canada still refuses to accept PRV as a disease agent, and so it does not prohibit the transfer of PRV-infected smolts from farm hatcheries into marine farms. So in my view, the regulations concerning virus are simply not working. It's good for the industry. It's regulatory failure to protect wild salmon. I feel quite strongly that joint industry-government science should be carefully reviewed for fraud. I don't say this lightly, but if you look at the definition of fraud as posted by Elsevier, one of the biggest publishers of scientific journals in the world, falsification includes changing or omitting data or results in such a way that the research is not accurately represented. I feel this is exactly what is going on. But it wasn't the science that changed things in British Columbia. In 2017, First Nations began occupying Maui salmon farms for 280 days. Now, in Canada, Indigenous nations are recognized as federal governments, so what concerns them matters. Since 2018, 7 First Nations have forced Maui, Grieg, and Cermak to close 47 salmon farms in British Columbia. That leaves 60. Here's what it looks like. This is the BC coast showing all the farms. This is 2020, and this is 2023. This is important. because this inside passage here is where a very large number of wild salmon from British Columbia migrate and were heavily exposed to the farms. They're still exposed, and the minister has to make a decision on the rest of these farms this year. We are getting the first opportunity in the world to study what happens to wild salmon when you take the farms out. It's very preliminary, but here you see the blue circle is the last 3 generations of pink salmon that were exposed to salmon farms when they went to sea. And the green ring is how many came back from a generation, the first generation, that were not exposed to the salmon farms in this area. Very preliminary, but we are studying this, and the initial results are positive. Going forward, and the decision to be made on the last 60 farms in British Columbia, there are serious challenges, and one of them is that companies are offering large sums of money to First Nations to keep the last farms open. DFO industry joint science is a legal impediment to the minister closing farms, because the industry can come back and say, but you have science saying that we are not impacting wild salmon. Salmon farmers are refusing to acknowledge their impact, and they are not on a path to diffuse the situation by agreeing to move on to land. And so what we're seeing is this collision of corporate law, Indigenous rights, politics, trade laws, and extinction. And there's a rift between the minister and her department, and it is widening as internal documents reveal what appears to be scandalous behavior. So my thoughts on Iceland, as we push the industry out of these waters, I'm worried they will become more aggressive in your waters, and I do apologize for that. But I think the most important thing is to investigate the relationship between the salmon farmers and your government. Really watch your politicians, because I can guarantee you the industry's talking to them, and they are very persuasive. For sure, do more science, find out what's happening with sea lice and the pathogens in your waters. But what is really going to make the difference is the relationship between industry and your government, and whether your government feels good about what they are doing, the way they're handling this. And furthermore, regulations mean nothing, because there is no way to farm salmon in the ocean in net pens without loading the region around the farm with the level of pathogens that wild salmon are simply not designed to survive. It is a myth that you can regulate an open net pet farm to protect wild salmon. After 40 years, we know there's no place in the world where wild salmon have remained abundant when they are exposed to salmon farms. If there was, and I have looked, we could learn from it. But instead, what we have learned is salmon farms kill wild fish. So the decision is really not whether to have salmon farms. There's a lot of forms of salmon farms. You could have salmon farms on land. But the decision you are facing is whether you want wild salmon. So I wish you luck, and please contact me if you have any questions about this presentation or anything else. Thank you so much.